Welcome, everyone. We're just going to give it a second as people are joining. We're so glad to have you here today. We'll get started in just a minute. Thank you all for joining. We're going to start in just a second. I see folks are still joining. Okay, as folks continue to join, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here, everyone, and welcome to the IIP's monthly webinar. This one is focused on grounding police accountability and community engagement. For those who don't know me, I'm Rachel Marshall, the Executive Director of the IIP, and the IIP hosts these monthly webinars to provide education, strategies, and insight for prosecutors and stakeholders in improving their approaches to public safety. The IIP provides a national platform to bring together prosecutors, policy experts, and the communities they serve to promote data-driven strategies, cutting-edge scholarship, and innovative thinking. The IIP champions criminal justice reform policies that advance community-centered standards of safety, fairness, and dignity. And with that in mind, we are really excited for today's session, which is really focused on communities. And we're going to be talking about how to effectively engage communities while pursuing police accountability work. And our panelists, who I'll introduce in a minute, bring tremendous expertise to this topic. So I'm really excited to jump in. Today's discussion, as I mentioned, is really around how prosecutors and attorneys general can approach police accountability work. And we know that community members play a pivotal role in police oversight and police accountability work and are critical to the success of those initiatives that are implemented by state attorneys general and local prosecutors. We are building off of our previous webinar that some of you may have seen, which was called Not Above the Law, Prosecuting Police Misconduct. And today's webinar will focus on some of the findings from one of the papers in our recent publication series as part of our State Attorneys General Police Oversight and Accountability Network project. And you can learn more about that on our website. This webinar will provide tools and strategies for prosecutors and attorneys general to use in effectively engaging communities in police accountability work. So I'm really excited to introduce today's impressive panelists, and Noah's going to drop in the link in the chat to the fuller bios. They have all very impressive long bios, and for the sake of time, I'll keep them somewhat brief, but we encourage you to read their full bios in the chat. First, I'm delighted to introduce a really pivotal member of our project and our State Attorneys General Police Accountability and Oversight Network, Lisa Madigan, who served as Illinois Attorney General from 2003 to 2019. She was the first female Attorney General in Illinois and became the longest serving Attorney General in the state's history. During her tenure, Lisa established a national reputation as an influential advocate and reformer, prioritizing protecting children and women from violence and effecting really important systemic police reforms that, of course, we'll be talking about today. After a federal investigation into the practices of the Chicago Police Department, Attorney General Madigan filed an historic lawsuit against the city of Chicago for the police department's systemic civil rights violations, and that resulted in a comprehensive consent decree to reform the department. Attorney General Madigan oversaw the historic engagement of community members through widespread community roundtables, which resulted in more than 6,000 comments that directly impacted the drafting of the consent decree. Former Attorney General Madigan is now a partner at Kirkland & Ellis, where she leads a team of lawyers and staff who contributed over 5,000 hours pro bono, assisting the Minnesota Department of Human Rights investigation of the Minneapolis Police Department in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. Welcome, Lisa. We're so excited to have you. Next, I'm delighted to welcome Jonathan Darch, who was appointed Executive Director of the NYC Civilian Complaint Review Board, or the CCRB, in 2017 after serving as its chief prosecutor. He joined the CCRB in 2012 as the board's first deputy chief prosecutor, helping establish the agency's administrative prosecution unit, the only division of its kind among the nation's civilian police oversight entities. Prior to joining the CCRB, Jonathan worked as an assistant district attorney at the Queens County District Attorney's Office. He began his career in public service as a staffer for New York Senator Chuck Schumer. Welcome, Jonathan. Excited to have you. Next, I'm thrilled to welcome Victoria Davis, who's the founder of Sisters for Justice and the sister of Delron Small. Delron Small was killed by a New York Police Department officer in July of 2016 while he was driving his girlfriend, teenage stepdaughter, and 4-month-old child home from a family gathering. Delron had been driving down Atlantic Avenue when he was cut off by Officer Isaacs, who continued to drive in a reckless manner. At a stoplight, Delron stepped out of his car to tell him that his driving was endangering others on the road. Officer Isaacs was off duty and in his personal vehicle at the time, and he rolled down his car window and shot Delron 3 times. Afterwards, he left him to bleed to death on the street, offering no emergency aid and only dialing 911 to claim that he had been the one who was attacked. Although Officer Isaac was charged and prosecuted for murder by the Attorney General, he was ultimately acquitted at trial. In 2020, the Civilian Complaint Review Board substantiated charges against Officer Isaacs, beginning the process to hold a disciplinary hearing. Welcome, Victoria, and thank you for all your advocacy in this field. We're delighted to have you. Next, I'm excited to welcome Sam Sinyangwe, a policy analyst and data scientist who works with communities of color to fight systemic racism. As the founder of Mapping Police Violence and Police Scorecard, he collects and uses data as a tool for fighting police violence and advancing comprehensive policies. Previously, Samuel worked at PolicyLink to support a national network of communities to build cradle-to-career systems of support for low-income families. He also worked with city leaders, youth activists, and community organizations to develop comprehensive agendas to achieve quality education, health, and justice for young Black men. He's a graduate of Stanford University, where he studied how race and racism impact the US political system. Welcome, Sam. We're excited to have you. And last but certainly not least, we have Caroline Nobu, who's a research scholar, and law and executive director of the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School, where she provides strategic direction and leadership to the Justice Collaboratory's unique network of interdisciplinary scholars and staff. Her research as a criminologist focuses on promoting transparency and trust in the criminal legal system. Her expertise includes policing, gun violence, data systems, community-based research methodologies, and the progressive prosecutor movement. Caroline is the co-author of the 2023 book, Legitimacy-Based Policing and the Promotion of Community Vitality. Welcome, Caroline. Welcome to all of our amazing panelists. So much to get into in this conversation today. And I'm going to start where I ended with you, Caroline, if I could, because I think before we start talking in depth about how to really engage communities in police accountability work, I think we should step back and think about the role of policing historically in communities. So I'm hoping you can give us a little brief summary. I know it's a lot to cover, but how has policing and the role of policing really evolved over time and throughout history? How has culture changed over time? Can you sort of ground us in some of that background?
Sure. First of all, thank you, Rachel, for having me today. And Victoria, I always, when I'm in spaces with you, want to acknowledge and say, I'm so sorry for your loss and being here with us. Yeah, I could honestly easily spend the entire hour-long webinar talking about the history of policing and how we got to the culture that we have today. But frankly, I'm not even going to give you the Cliff Notes version. I'm going to give you the TikTok reel version, right? So we're going to go fast. But I think to start, it's important to think where we got to, policing in the United States. It's sort of a mix of early UK policing in the 1800s, mixed with US slave patrols in the southern states, which means policing has a legacy of racial injustice. Will definitely come up later today in some of our other conversations. So we had sort of first model police forces created with the idea of a prevention and a detection of crime. The goal was to deter crime and keep the peace. This was started seeing these forces again in the 1800s. Policing has increasingly grown harsher with a wider mandate because of tough on crime policies at the federal level that trickled down to local policing. Broken windows, 3 strikes, stop and frisk, these sort of policies. And so today we've ended up with a police force that is the most visible arm of the state, right? When we think of the state, we think of the criminal legal system. Police are the most visible part of this. And we have a current policing model that is based on dominating peoples and situations via the implied or explicit use of force. A lot of people today will talk about the militarization of the police. This is something that picked up in the United States in the 1960s and almost saw immediately people expressing their anger and fear of police brutality. So almost immediately as we saw a transition from the guardian model to a warrior culture, people were immediately expressing distrust and that this wasn't really a form of justice. And following this militarization, that we started to see that police were really armed to the teeth, right? Like billions of dollars spent to militarize our local police departments. So where we are now. So sort of as a reaction to this mission of crime control on the basis of deterrence, police departments have widely adopted this warrior culture. It is a sanction-based model. It requires the police to project force and be willing to use threat of force to ensure compliance. Police officers are trained in the use of force. And they are, as we just mentioned, they are equipped with like a variety of weapons to support this approach. This leads to a culture focused on the capacity to deploy force and create this culture of dominance. Certainly the cost of a warrior culture of policing is high. It's high in terms of brutality, monetarily, and certainly in terms of trust. So that's sort of how we get to where we are today.
Thank you, Caroline. And Lisa, I want to turn to you to weigh in on the impact of all of that. Sort of what happens when police abuse the trust that communities place in them, and sort of how does this deterioration of trust that we were sort of hearing about, how does that impact communities, the public more broadly, public safety, all of that?
So first, let me say thank you for having us today, and thank you for all of the work that you and everybody involved with this project has done. I think it's been very important to have these conversations and to provide these resources. So I'm happy to join you today. I think following up on what Caroline said, I would say a few things. One, I have been working with police departments for over 30 years and very specifically focused on what we tend to call community policing, but really to develop those relationships between police officers and community members so that we don't have a circumstance where there is this lack of trust. And obviously in Chicago, there is a lot of history that is not good history between the police and people in communities. What happens, right, when there is a lack of trust is absolutely, it costs lives, it costs money, and like some of the practical implications of what we end up seeing is that it simply doesn't work because you don't have community members who are willing to engage with the police to help them identify and to solve crimes. So you have actually higher crime rates. You have lower levels of solved crimes, and you have people who, feel as if they are living in communities who, in essence, have to protect themselves sometimes, as opposed to being able to rely on the police. And so it's very challenging, as in any relationship where there is a lack of trust, for the police to effectively do their jobs because they have also made themselves in some ways unsafe in the community because people don't trust them, and for people to actually live in safe communities. So I think the unfortunate reality is that because of the history that's transpired across the country in terms of the policing model that Caroline went through, is that we have broken trust and we have an enormous amount of damage that has to be remediated if we want to turn that around and provide for public safety in our communities.
Rachel, could I add one quick thing? So first, I also want to say thank you for inviting me to join you, and to piggyback on what Lisa was saying, on a practical level for a state prosecutor or a local prosecutor, lack of trust in the police transfers to a lack of trust in the prosecutor. And people are less likely to come forward as witnesses when you need them to testify. They might be willing to report a crime when it is in progress, but afterwards, when they are confronted with the reality of coming forward to testify, they may not cooperate. And the second element is, in our jury system, You have juries that many of the segments of our community come into the jury system predisposed not to trust the police witnesses that a prosecutor might be putting forward.
That's such an important point, and we're going to get into that in just a moment because I really want to follow up on what you just said, John. I want to ask, as we still paint the picture a little bit of what things look like on the ground now, Victoria, I wanted to turn to you because I know after the horrific killing of your brother, you've done so much community advocacy and talk to community members all the time about what the state of policing is in their communities and how they feel. What are some of the primary concerns that you hear when you talk to community members about the policing of their communities? How do they want it to change most?
Well, I would start by saying that what Lisa and John raised were true. Like those issues with a broad stroke are true. But on a community level, I also think that on a community level, I would say that the mistrust, right, is coming from a place of like wanting to not be re-victimized. So if a person is reporting something, we see on the news all the time that people are reporting, and when the police come, there have been instances where people are victimized in even worse ways, right? And so that's a fear because these incidents are being televised. We're seeing it as we should, and we should know that these things are happening. But I think that for like right now, I think that the issues change. I believe last year I had raised the issue of community policing and what that actually looks like, and it being that term being so broad. I think now we're when we make it a little smaller, it's the fear of being a victim all over again, and by the people who are supposed to protect us. So I think that that's what I've been hearing lately. Yeah.
Thanks for bringing that perspective in. And I think that's helpful to turn to you, Sam, to sort of get more of a data perspective of, that fear of victimization that Victoria was just talking about. What does the data actually show about that? I mean, how many people are victimized by police violence each year through all of the data that you collect?
So I've been collecting data on police violence for a decade now, and really ever since the Ferguson uprising in 2014, when it became clear that the federal government back then and even to this day still doesn't have a comprehensive and public database of deadly police violence, let alone all of the other forms of police violence that are often even more frequent and less likely to be reported. And so that has been my work and my organization's work to collect that information. What we found is that at least 1,200 people are killed by police in a given year. And that is not a level of police violence that is new. That is a fairly constant level. Each and every year, we see about 1,200 people killed by police with a slight increase year over year. And for each person killed by police, there are more than 300 people who are non-fatally harmed by police use of force. And so even most recently, we conducted the largest study of non-fatal police use of force ever in this country. We filed public records requests to 3,000 police agencies across the country, every city, every county with 50,000 or more population, and a number that were actually smaller than that. And we obtained all of their use of force records from 2017 through 2022. What we found was that not only were we seeing at least 300,000 people, according to the data that we've seen and our estimates, that are impacted by this police violence, but the racial disparities year after year are also consistent. And we see in deadly use of force data that Black people are about 2.6 times more likely to be killed by police than white people per population. And that disparity is actually even larger when you look at non-fatal police use of force. It exceeds 3 times a disparity. What we also see when we look at the data is that there are these patterns. When we talk about a pattern and practice of discriminatory policing or excessive force, you can spot that in the data. It is plainly apparent when you look at, when you rank departments by the rate of police violence, either by population or per arrest. There are a set of police departments that consistently, year after year, report far higher rates of police violence than other police departments. Places like Indianapolis, places like Minneapolis, places like St. Paul, places like Oklahoma City. And some of those places have seen DOJ interventions, whether that's at the state level or the federal level, but most have not. And in an environment where you have 18,000 different law enforcement agencies, we really are scratching the surface in terms of accountability when we look at pattern and practice investigations, where we see a handful in a given year under a good administration and none under a different administration. So, this is something where when we look at accountability, there are huge gaps, huge issues. Only about 1.9% of cases where somebody's killed by police results in an officer being charged with a crime. But when you look at the jurisdictions where officers are prosecuted for those incidents, even seeing how rare it is in general, what that means is, you have about 3,000 counties in the US, each with their own elected prosecutors. And only over the past decade, there have only been about 200 of those places, those counties, where officers have been charged with a crime for killing somebody over the past decade, which means the vast majority of prosecutors have never charged an officer in their career for the use of deadly force. And what's also interesting when you think about accountability is there are certain pockets, certain counties where you're seeing 2, 3, 4, even 5 cases where officers are charged. So the default is 0 officers. The norm is 0. But there are some counties where prosecutors, for whatever reason, are able, despite the barriers to seeking accountability in these cases, despite all of the issues that we know in creating in very permissive legal standards around use of force, in the preferences of juries to often side with police officers' accounts. Despite those barriers to accountability, we actually see some prosecutors are able to charge officers repeatedly in cases. And when you look at the demographics of those prosecutors, despite the fact, for example, that Black women are about 1% or fewer of the nation's elected prosecutors, there's 17% of the elected prosecutors who have charged officers in multiple cases over that time period. So there's a lot we're still learning now that we do have this data about what those prosecutors might be doing differently, what approaches they might be taking to actually succeed in not only charging, but convicting officers in those cases, those egregious cases. And I think there's a lot more for us to learn in terms of best practices from the places that the data indicates are doing something a little bit different when it comes to accountability.
Such important points. And I just want to reiterate, too, that we did a webinar last month on how to prosecute police officers individually that I encourage folks to check out. We can put the link in the chat. But of course, there's so many routes to police accountability pursuits that we're talking about today. And Sam, I really appreciate you bringing it back to prosecutors and the role that they have. And John, I want to turn back to something you said earlier as a result. You talked about how it impacts not just the work of police, but the work of prosecutors when there's this distrust in the community. How can prosecutors start to be aware of those strained relationships, ideally before they get to this peak problem? And sort of how are they looking at the CCRB complaints that come in? Sort of how are prosecutors addressing and keeping their eyes on relationships with policing within communities?
So in New York State, in 2020, the legislature and repealed Civil Rights Law 50A, which kept police, fire, and correction officer disciplinary history secret. And the repeal of that bill, that law, which is really thanks to work by advocates like Sam and Victoria, not anything the CCRB did, the data about individual police officers is much easier for prosecutors to get. We share in New York City, the CCRB shares the updated disciplinary histories every quarter with prosecutors, so that with prosecutors' offices, so that the individual prosecutor in individual cases can let defense attorneys know about the CCRB histories of the police witnesses in a criminal case. And I think just that as a first step is very important for allowing prosecutors to keep an eye on what's going on with the relation between police and the community in their jurisdiction.
Thank you. So Carolyn, I want to turn back to you. You work a lot with prosecutors as well, and sort of what can prosecutors, as well as law enforcement more generally, do as initial steps to start trying to build some of that trust that we've been talking about has been so lost? And how does procedural justice play into that?
Yeah, well, I think I want to talk specifically about procedural justice, but when we're talking about the goals of the system, right? And the goals of the system are to prevent crime, to provide safety, to uphold justice. I think one of the goals of the system also needs to be trust. It's one of the goals. And so procedural justice, there are 4 pillars of procedural justice. It can be used as a framework to elevate community perceptions of legitimacy and then increase trust. So individual perceptions of procedurally just encounters are based on 4 central features on the way people interact with legal authority. So it's whether or not they were treated with dignity and respect, whether they were given a voice, whether the decision maker, in this case the prosecutor, was neutral and transparent, and whether the prosecutor conveyed trustworthy motives. All of these things increase trust and the perceived legitimacy of the authority. So as the body of research on procedural justice continues to grow, it's evident that with training, the concept can take hold at both the individual level, but also the organizational level. Okay, so we can see line district attorneys, line prosecutors doing this, but also sort of systemic change at the office level. Procedural justice furthers agencies' efforts to restore strained community relationships because it means they're laying the groundwork for legitimacy along the way. So certainly, prosecutors are granted legal legitimacy in the sense that they are legally authorized to perform their duties. However, in the context of procedural justice, what we're talking about is legitimacy is referring to the extent to which an organization, the office, and its prosecutors are perceived as morally just, as honest, and worthy of trust and confidence. So why does this matter? To Jonathan's point, to Lisa's point, higher perceptions of legitimacy improve compliance and they improve cooperation through improved attitudes towards legal authority and the prosecutors. And as a result, procedural justice becomes this powerful tool in improving public safety because people are more likely to participate with the office as witnesses, victims, the accused, diversion programs, all of that. So again, the goal is trust, the goal is legitimacy. Procedural justice is a framework to how we get there.
Rachel, can I
Please.
be back on what Caroline just said? So it has been 10 years since I was at the Queen's DA's office and 20 years since I was a new prosecutor. And I think one of the most important things that Caroline brought up is there's a difference between what individual line prosecutors can do and what the organizational atmosphere and culture can do. Because in 18 years ago, when I was a new assistant at the Queen's DA's office, and I spoke to the police witness and got what I thought was the correct version of events and went to my supervisor to try and dispose of the case appropriately, he essentially, not to speak ill of the dead, so I won't say his name, told me to walk across the street and go work for legal aid if I was going to come handing in that fertilizer. And then eventually calmed down and asked me where I got that version of events was. And when I explained it was from the police officer, he offered a disorderly conduct to resolve the matter. And that kind of and I don't want to speak as I said, it's been 20 years since I was a new prosecutor and had to deal with that kind of environment. And I'd like to think things have changed, but that's why it's important for if you are a young prosecutor on this call to stick to your guns, but also if you are a more experienced supervisor who's on this call, to think about the example you are setting and the tone you are setting in your office and in your unit.
I think that's so important. And I think some of it, the challenge has been that there haven't been a lot of tools or resources for prosecutors, local prosecutors, attorneys general to think about how to approach this work. which is a large part of why we're having this discussion and a lot of the work that we've been doing with attorneys general and local prosecutors. So I want to highlight one particular example of real leadership when it comes to this, which, as I mentioned in her bio, is what Lisa Madigan did in Chicago. And just to provide a little bit of context, before I turn to you, Lisa, to sort of walk us through a little bit about how that went, and particularly how you engaged community so effectively throughout that process, which is why we're here today. But in 2015, the Department of Justice investigated the Chicago Police Department's practices following the fatal shooting of Laquan McDonald. And that report found racially discriminatory policing, excessive use of force, all sorts of patterns within the Chicago Police Department. But the federal administration decided not to seek a consent decree. And so in response, you filed an historic lawsuit against the city of Chicago, which resulted in a comprehensive consent decree, the appointment of a federal monitor, and a lot of really effective community engagement went into that I'm hoping you can talk to us about, and sort of walk us through how you gained the support of the community in that process and how you incorporated community voices into the work that you did in the consent decree.
So, like Caroline said about the history of policing, I could respond to your question for the rest of the hour, but let me try to focus in on a few points that I think are most important. One, the history of policing in Chicago is not dissimilar to that around the rest of the country. There have obviously been crises over the decades, and oftentimes in the aftermath, right, there's a Blue Ribbon Commission put together, they do an investigation, they come up with a report, and every so many decades, there's this promise of reform that ultimately never happened. And so a lot of bad history in the city and a lot of community distrust that had built up. And so I knew at the beginning of our process that it was absolutely critical for us to work on rebuilding that trust. And the only way to do that was to have significant and real community engagement. And so that was one of my main priorities. I have seen, what often, suffices for community engagement in these processes. And it's, for lack of a better description, it's kind of that open mic in a gymnasium where people are given 30 seconds a minute. And there's a panel of government people sitting, up on a stage that, listen. And then that's it. And there's no, they don't see the connection between the time they have taken and the stories they have shared and the solutions they have provided and what ultimately happens. And so instead, we have this cycle of alleged reform, community, and what's called community engagement, and yet no real change. And so we decided that we had to go into the community and set it up in a meaningful way to receive feedback and information that would actually inform our consent decree negotiations. And we didn't do this individually. We worked with professionals in participatory democracy. So we worked with people from the University of Illinois at Chicago in terms of the design of the roundtables. And we thought about every detail from reaching out to the appropriate community leaders who could help us once we explained to them what we wanted to do and the reason we wanted their engagement. They would help us identify and invite other members of the community. We worked with them to pick a location in the community that was considered a safe space to be. So we didn't necessarily go to a school, we didn't go to a police department. Oftentimes we were using either community spaces, churches in particular we used. We had food from local restaurants. That sounds silly, but we were doing most of these meetings in the evening and we had to feed people. We found out we had to provide childcare because people were bringing their children. If we wanted them to be able to participate and stay, we had to think through that. We had trained moderators. We had another individual who was an actual note taker. We had people who then had an opportunity at the end to discuss what they deemed to be, the important issues and solutions that they had identified. And then at the end of this process, we had a report that was written up. As I think, Rachel, you said at the beginning, we harvested over 6,000 comments, and we use those comments directly in our negotiations. And so you can see, members of the community can see, I said this, and then here is that provision in the ultimate consent decree. So we wanted there to be accountability on us, but we also wanted there to be meaningful participation from the community, because right, they're the people who are oftentimes over-policed and have to contend with the aftermath of the use of excessive or deadly force. And unless we are listening to community members and actually putting that into action, we're not providing public safety. And we're not really providing, I think, what representative government is even supposed to do. So we took it very seriously. You can actually see the report that we wrote up. It's public. It goes through every single solitary comment. And it was an incredibly successful way for us to engage community members throughout the city of Chicago.
Thank you so much. And I just want to follow up on John's point as well, because Lisa is such a good example of sort of the high level, the leader in the office, really incorporating community voices. I want to think a little bit about what you also said, John, in terms of having the line prosecutors really engaged in that work. And so, Victoria, I wanted to bring you in to talk kind of both the good and the bad. So what are some things that you have seen when you talk to folks in the community or in your own experiences that line prosecutors do wrong, that doesn't cultivate trust when talking to community members? And then are there some examples of prosecutors that have done things differently and done them right when interacting with community members who've been affected by police violence? And how can others on this call learn from some of that?
Yes, thank you. So I absolutely love everything that Lisa just stated. Like, that's exactly what it should look like. Oftentimes people in the community may feel powerless. They may feel like, I'm not a politician, I'm not an attorney, I'm not, I'm not like these, I don't hold space in those spaces, so therefore I don't have a voice. So when you meet the community where they're at, you go to them, like especially in places of faith and worship, and you go there where the community is. They're like, oh, okay, well, what's going on here? And you have them engage and do Q&As. Then they feel like they have a voice. I think that that's the first step, just allowing people to have agency and autonomy over their community that is being policed. Because these are taxpayers, the people who are paying their taxes, which is ultimately paying the salaries of the police who are policing their communities, right? So they should have a say on what that looks like. And I think that that was like extremely important in my brother's case. The Attorney General's office, when they handled his case, my brother and I had no idea what to do, what the next steps were, what they looked like. I mean, I think that I've said out loud, like, what am I supposed to do? Like, I'm just a sister. Like, I don't know what to do. And the Attorney General's office inviting us in, calling, giving us updates, asking us questions, and getting to know who Delron was as a human being instead of who he was the night that he was victimized and ultimately killed was extremely important. It was very humanizing. I think too often in these communities, people are being dehumanized. So bringing back like humanity into the situation, because police officers aren't policing robots; they're policing human beings with the goal in mind for safety and security. But only that community can say what safety and security looks like. It's the same way we can only, as family members of Delron, can say what justice looked like for our brother. Unfortunately, he doesn't have a voice. So we're his voice, and we're stepping out on faith, and we're like, I hope we're doing the right thing, because this has never happened before. I hope it doesn't happen to anyone else, but how can we help? And so for you guys, I definitely want to thank even this platform, right, for lending space to myself and my brother and allowing us to come back, right, from the community and speaking from a ground perspective of like, okay, well, this is what it looks like as per the work that we've done in the community. And not seeing us as like victims, but as people of the community who are representing someone who we love dearly, who was victimized, and also people that we care about who may unfortunately be victimized in the future.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's such an important point for the line prosecutors and assistant attorneys general on this call, just to remember to humanize and not just focus on just that moment. So thank you for sharing that experience, Victoria, and that perspective. Zooming out a little bit, I want to turn to you, Sam, for some of the data piece about how can prosecutors, whether line prosecutors, whether electeds, how can they effectively use data analysis to gain insights into the needs of the community and to hearing their voices, and where do they need to get better?
So I think there are a couple of opportunities to make progress here. One, we already have enough data to start thinking differently about where to intervene and how to intervene, particularly when it comes to initiating pattern and practice investigations. Now, I think the approach of the federal government to date has really been reactive. They have sort of sat back and waited until there is a high-profile incident or a major uprising to decide to launch an investigation and put a police department under a consent decree. But when we look at the data and we zoom out, for every one of those police departments, you could identify 100 police departments that have the same level of use of force or higher, the same disparities or worse, that never get an intervention and that are like ticking time bombs if you don't have an approach that really treats this as a systemic issue that needs a scalable nationwide approach. And so already with the data that we have, and not only the data that we've been able to collect at policedata.org, which is all public, you can see each police department and the rate of use of force and the trends over time and how they compare. But also you have many states now that are stepping up, including under the leadership of many AGs, most notably in New Jersey, to create their own use of force databases that for the first time provide some insight statewide into what's happening with use of force. In New Jersey, they even publish individualized data with a turnaround time of a few weeks since the incident, with officer names. They have department level data, officer level data, every type of force is being tracked. And all of that is publicly posted, including the source data by the New Jersey Attorney General. So that allows for a different approach. You can then look at your entire state and see, actually, you can pick a threshold, for example, and say, if you are in the top 10% or 20% highest rate of force in the state, you should be on notice. There should be some sort of early warning system, not just within the department, but across the state, where investigations should be initiated to figure out what's going on in each of those places, not just the one or two that make the news. And so I think ultimately, we need to think of this as a problem that is all across the country. There are 18,000 different agencies. They each have their own policies and practices, report different outcomes and disparities. And so data can provide a roadmap for helping to identify a large number of places where there are serious warning signs that an investigation is needed and probably some sort of a consent decree. And indeed, when we look at the data on agencies that have received those interventions, there are 28 police departments across the country that were under an active consent decree at the state or federal level from 2017 through 2022. Of those 28 agencies, we got data from 18 of them, so most of those agencies. When you look at those 18 agencies, on average, there was a 22% reduction in overall use of force and a 22% reduction in less lethal force, which is force involving weapons like tasers and batons, some of the more serious types of force, on average across those agencies that were under consent decree during that time period. And places like Chicago, right, under the leadership of Lisa Madigan initiating these investigations, Chicago has seen substantial reductions in reported use of force by more than a third during that time period. So already we're seeing that many of these agencies that do receive interventions, pattern practice investigations, get put under consent decrees, are showing some early progress in reducing overall use of force. And that is critically important. But again, we're talking about 28 agencies of the 18,000 across the country during that time period. So we really need to think about using data in a different way to scale up what is working. and also to look back and see what might not be working in particular cases. So a notable case is Albuquerque. Albuquerque had been under consent decree for something like a decade, the past decade. They initially had one of the highest rates of deadly police use of force in the country when that investigation was initiated. That investigation just or the consent decree that they were put under just concluded. The DOJ said that they had met the terms of the consent decree, but actually their rate of deadly force actually increased during that time period. And so there are cases where these interventions have, for whatever reason, not worked. And we also need to understand what's not working in those cases so that we don't replicate that as we scale up this approach.
Really, really helpful. Thank you, Sam. I want to turn back to you, John, to talk a little bit about some of your work with CCRB. And since we're talking about some of the best practices that prosecutors can use, what best practices can they employ to support sort of the transparency and independence of civilian review complaint boards during investigations? And how can the autonomy and integrity of civilian complaint boards contribute to establishing community trust in the law enforcement process and decisions that are made?
So thank you for that question, Rachel, but I wanted to address one thing Sam said, and that is you may think, if you are a line prosecutor, that what Sam was just talking about, the pattern and practice, doesn't really apply to you, but it does. Because if you can think of the crimes the cases that come across your desk, how often is there a difference in the plea for essentially the same conduct that you offer people that's different based on the individual circumstances of the case? But when you take a step back, it is mostly white people getting violations and Black people getting misdemeanors. And so that is not something that feels good to look at and to think about, because I remember thinking, like, I am here to do justice, and like, you're just treating every case individually on its merits. But when you take a step back and look, it'll give you an idea about whether or not you are actually doing justice. And then with regards to Rachel's question, just to answer it directly, in New York City, we have a system where if a prosecutor asks us to hold off on an investigation because they are trying to investigate an incident in which one party has been accused of a crime, and the officer may be accused of a crime or merely of having committed misconduct, it is often a prosecutor's first instinct to ask us to hold off on the CCRB investigation, because you don't want different witness testimonies that could conflict with your prosecution. And by doing that, you severely impact the ability of my agency to conduct a full investigation in enough time that we can recommend discipline to the department before the SOL expires. And that for less serious forms of discipline, if we make recommendations to the department for discipline closer than 3 months to the statute of limitations expiring, they will not even look at the complaint. So when you ask my agency to put a hold on an investigation, think if you really need us to, because if misconduct did occur during that incident, even a short hold puts a major impact on whether my agency will be able to find the officer responsible for the misconduct to conduct an investigation in enough time.
Thank you. Caroline, both John and Sam have mentioned, and obviously, and Lisa's investigation as well, we've talked a little bit about some of the racial bias that exists throughout so many police departments in the country and discrimination against particularly Black individuals. What specific strategies do you see that state attorneys general, local prosecutors can implement to try to address some of that systemic racism that is so persistent within police departments and law enforcement agencies more generally? It's a huge question that could be its own.
You're really throwing me the softballs today, aren't you?
Easy one.
All right, so first, I'll acknowledge that I think there is dissonance on whether the criminal legal system in general should or could contribute to these efforts or strategies at all, and how best they could do so. I'll answer the question to the best of my ability, just like with the note that I think sort of community-led quests for things like reconciliation and reparations are probably, like, in the long term, a better option than like prosecutor-led like reconciliation. But I think what is very meaningful are gestures of sincere reconciliation on behalf of the prosecutor office. One, and what I would call just any sort of deposit into the community bank of trust that is sincere in its effort of reconciliation. You know, certainly one way of doing this is to prosecute police officers who have criminal behavior, right? That's one way of ensuring this as a prosecutor, is to just do your job and prosecute crimes, even if it's a police officer is doing them. I also think I'll just mention CIUs, so conviction integrity units. There's one in Connecticut. It's a great way for prosecutors to acknowledge their role in maybe past wrongful convictions, acknowledge law enforcement's role in these sort of things. And I think more importantly, it does sort of acknowledge its duty to rectify past harms and to safeguard the integrity of the criminal legal system going forward. Better training and recruitment. I mean, we're seeing some of the largest offices in our country do training on things like implicit bias, on reconciliation, on procedural justice. So, and then of course, yeah, I would say procedural justice. I think it's important that offices take time to review past policies, procedures, written materials, all of that, for things like neutrality and transparency, and do reviews in that way.
Yeah, so let me follow up on that training piece with you, Lisa, if I could, because prosecutors, local, state, can influence police training. And how can they effectively incorporate community voices? How can they think about their role in training police?
So this is a good question, and it's coming up, and I think these practices are changing around the country. You know, part of the consent decree in Chicago obviously required training, and some of the training that Caroline just mentioned, implicit bias training, for instance. But we also had, you know, because we went and watched police training, and we have had in Chicago community members participate in police training. And so that starts to build a relationship, build trust, and have a real influence in terms of, you know, what officers, new officers, as well as older officers who have to be retrained in different strategies and tactics, that they're able to, you know, gain from each other. And there really is, I mean, I've seen it, you know, there is an evolution that takes place. And so I would strongly suggest, you know, and this is partly what Sam was talking about earlier as well. We have problems, you know, across the country, and there are certainly, you know, terrific resources and trainings that are available, real best practices that can be put into place across the country. If you have a commitment or a demand coming from community to change the nature of policing. And it's, you know, one more point I want to make, it's not just for community, which is where it needs to be based, but it's also for officers and for their safety. And as part of the engagement that we did around the consent decree, we didn't just talk to community members, we did focus groups with police officers as well at every level. To hear, you know, their perspectives. And we learned a lot, both from community as well as from officers, to make sure that, you know, the model that we proposed was something that was going to work and address the problems systemically.
Thank you so much. And I want us, as we start to wrap up a little bit, I want us to think a little bit about transparency. And Sam, you mentioned New Jersey, you were talking about some of the ideal systems on a statewide level in terms of data transparency around police violence. Are there other systems that folks who are maybe line prosecutors or on the smaller scale that folks can use, and sort of what is your ideal version of police transparency look like, and how can that data be collected more effectively, large or small scale?
So I'll start large and try to zoom in. I think, I spoke about New Jersey. They have the gold standard use of force data collection right now. But use of force is one aspect of policing, and there are many other aspects that also ought to be tracked and where we need public data for a variety of reasons, most notably accountability and understanding solutions. And so California's Racial Identity Profiling Act, RIPA, as they call it, is another great example where, now every police department in the state of California, every officer has to record every stop that they make, what actions they took during the stop, why they took the stop, who they stopped, whether they used force, if they did use force, what type of force they used, and then what happened as the outcome of that interaction. And so that's even broader than a solely use of force data collection. But now we're talking about, all of these stops that are happening across the state, and having more information about the context in which officers are using force as a result. And so that is a great example of a state really stepping up and saying, we are going to create a standardized, systematic database of sort of the sum total of policing or police interaction. But there are still challenges with implementing that system. When you compare the information that many law enforcement agencies report to that state database, in the RIPA database in California, to the information that they might publish on their own websites or they provided to us via public records request, you'll see big gaps. You'll see many agencies that may have reported 100, 200 use of force incidents on their data dashboard on their website, but only reported 20 or 30 incidents to the state data collection program. So not only is it important to create these data systems at the state level or even at the local level if there's no such data dashboard or public data portal, but also it's important to really make sure that and hold those agencies accountable to not underreporting or failing to report important pieces of information about their own conduct. And so we not only need more states to step up and create these types of RIPA data collection systems or data collection systems like they have in New Jersey, but state attorneys general need to play an active role in enforcing that data collection, making sure that police departments are continuously and comprehensively reporting to those databases and creating mechanisms to hold them accountable if they're not. There was a huge issue where many police departments were found to have underreported race, information about race in many of their stops. And you could see it systematically. If they had a certain stop where they would use force, they wouldn't report the race of the person. If it was sort of a routine stop, then they would report the race of the person. And so when you calculate those disparities in use of force, you end up with an outcome that is very different than what it actually is on the ground. And so now we're seeing emerging data collection systems go online in many states now. Not only California, you have use of force data collection programs operational in dozens of states now to varying degrees. But there's also a need to make sure that those databases are accurate, to make sure that police are held accountable to reporting comprehensive information to them. And when they aren't, really holding them accountable to the fullest extent of the law.
Thanks, Sam. Victoria, I want to turn to you from some of the work that you do talking to community members. What are they seeking in terms of transparency or improved transparency? And have you seen any improvements in that arena?
So I did want to say in terms of training, implicit bias training that Lisa had mentioned, I think that is so important. I find that when Lisa was speaking, what came up for me was when I speak about the officer that killed my brother, Wayne Isaacs, when I tell people that he was Black, they're surprised. They can't believe it because they don't, so oftentimes people have a hard time understanding systemic racism, systemic issues. And so they're like, no. And then what I find is oftentimes they will make excuses. I've been on panels where there have been community members who have made excuses for the police officer. So like at first they were like speaking from a fair place, right? Like, okay, well, this wasn't correct or that wasn't just. And they were humanizing Delron. Now, the moment that they found out that he was a Black officer, they were kind of confused because they were kind of confused about the systemic part in which that officer was operating under his own implicit biases and him just the way that Delron was portrayed and then the media and whatever the media felt that his transgressions were, like those things were highlighted and became more important because this person was a member of law enforcement. So I think that when people are going into law enforcement, there needs to be some sort of accountability for our own way of thinking. When we come into any job, we're stepping in with our own biases, but also we have to be open-minded and willing to unlearn and relearn some things. And so I think that that is extremely important for just anyone in general. And then also for community members, when there's officers who's coming in and they're asking, and that is the time to speak to them. Yes, there is an inherent mistrust for a whole lot of reasons, but we have to be committed as a community and just as a country to want the change, and then to receive the change in ways that we've never saw before, but by addressing our own biases. We all have them. And so when people want to be a police officer, really digging into why they want to become a police officer. Do you frequent those communities? It doesn't matter what the person's race is. It really doesn't matter how they show up. What's in their heads? What's really going on in their minds? Do they connect with the communities that they come from? Are they working in communities that they're from? Would they work in the communities that they're even from? And so that they're not re-victimizing the same people that they may have been in community with before they put on a uniform.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I see that we do have some questions in the chat. So before we get to them, because I want to make sure we do, I want to give each of you an opportunity to kind of say your last thoughts before we answer these questions, in terms of what do you hope that prosecutors or anyone who's on this call take away from this discussion? What are some points that maybe you didn't get to address that you wanted to raise? And I can start in no particular order. Maybe John, it's been a minute since you've talked, so I'll turn to you.
So one of my big concerns about participating in this panel was I don't want to pretend like I am somehow better than the line prosecutor I was addressing my comments to. Looking back on the vantage of 20 years, see the mistakes I made and the failures of myself as being the prosecutor who I wanted to be when I swore an oath to follow the Constitution and be a prosecutor. And so I hope you all took what I was saying not as somehow differentiating myself from you all, but having gone through what you guys are going through and can see. I hope I was able to give you some insight and didn't seem pretentious. So thank you.
Caroline, I'll turn to you next.
Yeah, I mean, as sort of the token social scientist, right? I don't know, maybe Sam, you consider yourself a social scientist. No. I'll say that when I often talk about this stuff, I make this joke that it's not rocket science, but it is science. And at the end of the day, we do have a lot of research and a lot of evidence on how important it is to prioritize trust with our community, and that there is lots of evidence about what works. Did I freeze? I'm sorry if I froze. Oh, great. Just on my end, there is a lot of evidence about what works. And in this moment where we as a country have experienced a decline in crime over many generations, but are still experiencing low trust and legitimacy in the legal system, we need to do something different, right? We need to reorientate what our goals are. So when I work with prosecutor offices, I try and get them to think about the theory of things like safety, the theory of procedural justice, the theory of trust and legitimacy, so they can recalibrate the goals. And, you know, safety is not just the absence of crime, it is the presence of other things. And, you know, holistically, I think prosecutors can think about this when they're implementing new programs and policies and moving forward.
Sam, I'll turn to you.
Yeah, just building off of that point, you know, I think we have more information now and more data now than we've ever had about policing in general and police violence in particular. And so I think, you know, going back a decade ago when I got into this work, there was nothing. Like we didn't know how many people were killed by the police, let alone how many people were harmed. Now we have information at the agency level, data trends over time for thousands of agencies across the country. And so we need to think differently about how we can utilize these resources, how we can use these tools and apply them to better understand solutions and to make sure that those solutions achieve their desired goals. I think, you know, there are many ideas around how to fix policing or how to address police violence. And oftentimes those ideas exist in a vacuum. They're not actually put up against whether or not the places that implemented those ideas actually saw a reduction in police violence over time. And so now we have the capability to actually begin to evaluate those questions at scale across the country. And we should be doing that in every single state. I think the other thing is there are examples now that we can build on in terms of policy wins. There are databases that exist now that didn't exist before that other states can sign into law and begin to build, like to replicate and build off of what's happening in New Jersey or what's happening in California. And I think the other piece of this is while there are in general, the landscape of police violence and the picture of police violence is not good. And even to build off the last point, you know, is one where we're at historically low rates of crime, but historically high rates of police violence. And so we need to think about this and take this issue extremely seriously as it continues to get worse and worse year over year without a sort of systemic approach to solving it. And so that's the kind of approach that we need, something that is at scale, that is systemic, that is not cherry picking one or two agencies or one or two officers or cases, but is looking at the big picture, is looking at the big trends and really trying to intervene and disrupt those trends to protect people at scale across the country.
Thanks, Sam. Victoria, I'll turn to you.
Yes. So I just want to say thank you for having me. And also, I wanted to just point out that social media plays a huge role in all of our lives, right? The internet, just all of the things that come with it. And I think that prosecutors can use platforms like this to get out messages to the community. I think that we're living in a time where information is being thrown at us. And the algorithms in which people are receiving their information, it may be like self-serving, right? So just like understanding, I think like for the community, and then for people who are prosecuting cases, and even for like officers, right? Like when you separate them, we all have our duty to do a good job online, because the messaging that we're putting out about cases or about people, or we're seeing videos of people being killed, right? And people are watching them, and people are traumatizing themselves. And people have different thoughts when they walk away from those interactions, because I believe that people want to do a good job, and people want to know, why is this happening? Can it happen to me? Am I at risk of this sort of violence, right? So continue to do data-driven things like, okay, well, what are the trends? What is happening? What areas? And how is this happening? Because people want to know. And I think that's why people are watching these videos. I ask people not to watch them. It's a terrible thing to watch these videos, but I also think that some people do need to see them. They do need to see that it can happen. It can happen to anyone. And at any point, any small interaction with the wrong officer can lead to a fatal incident, or just a nearly fatal incident. But also the takeaways, and just continuing to speak about the trends and giving access to information as far as like the crime rates, and making that more accessible online, and have those things come up for people. And updates on cases, people look those things up, And again, if they're looking it up and they're looking for all of the bad stuff, that's what's going to come up for them. But seeing the cases where people have, I'm not sure what would be the proper word to use, but the cases where people aren't feeling as defeated as community members, right? So seeing those cases and pushing out information around those cases and updates as well, so people can feel empowered to do the right thing and give correct information so that we can start to reinforce those relationships appropriately. Because if we're seeing this information of like, you know, this is happening, that's happening, it does make people operate out of fear. So I'm not sure. I guess to sum it up, being more responsible online, being more responsible on social media, and just being more responsible about the information that we ourselves, you know, with the knowledge that we have, are putting out on social media regarding these cases, so that the community can start to buy in a little more.
Thank you, Victoria. And I know a lot of people feel so empowered by you sharing your story so openly, and appreciate how hard that must be for you to do this, and appreciate you being here and talking about it today. Lisa, I'll give you the last word for takeaways.
Okay, so what I want people who are participating today to hear is that community engagement is absolutely vital to having success in terms of public safety. And whether that comes in the form of so-called community policing, enhanced training, better policies, it is absolutely critical that you develop the relationships between the police and members of the community. And one of the things that I was most struck by when we were doing these roundtables around Chicago was reading through comments and hearing people say repeatedly, which I was shocked by. I mean, people who were living in communities that had been, you know, most impacted by unconstitutional policing, who would say, we understand that the police have a difficult job and they need to have means to reduce their stress. They need to have access to therapy. All we're asking for is to be treated like humans. And if people on both sides had the opportunity to develop relationships and to engage with each other and to inform their practices by that, I think we would have a very different situation on the ground. And so I don't want people to give up on the idea of community policing in places, and it's most places, where it does not exist and does not exist well, or it exists on paper only. I think that, you know, you can all look at your own lives, and everything is about relationships. And there has to be a good working relationship where people can communicate back and forth. If you're in the community with the people who are supposed to be in the community, helping protect you and your family. So I just want to say thank you for doing this work, and thank you to everybody who's participating today, because all the different viewpoints are very important for us to have. But it also says, look, we have the tools, we have the means, we know what works. We can do this, and we can do this much better.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions that we probably won't be able to get to all of them, and I apologize. We'll do them sort of rapid fire, where I'll throw them out and anyone can jump in if they want to respond. Caroline, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly answer one that Carol asked a couple of questions about this, using sports as an accountability mechanism.
Yeah, do you want to read that? I don't think everyone else can see the questions. So, yeah, go ahead, Caroline.
Okay, so one of the participants asked questions about sort of using community engagement efforts for police accountability, and she specifically linked to this COPS study about using basketball as a means to connect the community. And all I was going to say was that, like, what Carol is showing here is exactly sort of what I was trying to talk about, which is that this is not an initiative that probably people would pick up and say, like, oh, this is going to solve crime, this is going to prevent crime. But what it is that it's getting the police to think about that there are other goals as police and other goals of safety beyond just like traditional deterrence, arrest, like clearance rates, these sort of things. So I think any program, I think she wanted to know specifically, do you find that sports would help, sports help in general? I think anything that connects people, whether it's a book, a shared experience, playing sports, gets people to have a conversation, gets building trust between the community and the law enforcement or the legal authority, is like we're moving in this right direction, that we want communities that are vital and healthy and happy and are able to interact with one another, and takes down these barriers of us versus them. So it's an example. There are other great examples, and I think in our culture, sports personalities have a lot of credibility, and they're seen as credible messengers. They're seen as reliable narrators to people. And, sure, if you can leverage that to build trust, I see no fault in it.
Thanks,
Can
Carol.
I'm sorry, can I respond to that? The sports, so really quick. So speaking of that, the NYPD had something called Summer Night Light. I believe it's called Summer Night Lights. And I signed my son up for it. I have a now teenager, and I signed him up for it. And people were surprised. They're like, "Oh, it's run by the NYPD," and I was like, "Yeah, but this is me taking a step forward. This is me stepping out on faith. This is me putting my Black son right in this sport that is, going to help him build community." And it was fine over summer. It was fine. It was fine the first day. It was really community led. Also, I think that the people that were there to have a good time. There was a lot of kids that signed up for it, and there were it just was a good time, right? I was surprised that this program just ran so smoothly, and that it ran in that way. And I think that it would have sounded weird had someone said it to me as well. I would have probably been like, I don't know about that, right? But I did it. I stepped out on faith. I did it. He enjoyed it, and it was fine. But I think that those types of programs, I think that I had to change my way of thinking. So maybe last year, or maybe even the year before, right? Had someone proposed that idea to me, I'd be like, I would have felt very nervous, given the situation. I would have felt very nervous. I probably would have not wanted him in that environment in my mind, right? But then I stepped out and I took him all the way to the Bronx, and I said, let me go see what this environment actually looks like. And I did, and he was surprised. He looked like, oh, okay. And it was fine, and it went well. And so I think that was like pretty cool. So I don't know, but I think that sports can be used to bring people together. We just have to do it.
Yeah,
Thank you
I'm
both.
going to say 100% yes and yes to this. I mean, as I said to you earlier, I was doing work trying to implement community policing programs over 30 years ago in Chicago. And the piece of it that I was responsible for was like after school weekend programs with kids. And we absolutely brought in Isaiah Thomas because he grew up in Chicago and his brother was a police officer, and we had him come out. And it was, I mean, Victoria, it's exactly what you're saying. We had a lot of very skeptical parents, but all the kids were like, I want to be there. And it's just a good faith effort. And then you start, you're talking to people, you're a police officer, you're talking to parents, you're meeting kids, and you humanize both sides. And it does make a real difference.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that question, Carol. Real quick.
I just want to caution that if you have, it is important to use those programs in context of a culture that is actually promoting in the department treating people like humans, as opposed to where you have the people in the light blue shirts are treating people like humans, and then other officers in other units who don't have the same point of view, as Caroline referred to earlier. They see themselves as warriors more than guardians. And so I think you can't just have a basketball program in the summer and then not also you can have on paper all of the programs and even execute them, but if it's not part of a larger culture that is valuing improving police community relations, it doesn't work.
Thank you. We had a question in the chat about programs that offer to the public trainings for law enforcement, because we talk about the need to train police officers. What about training the public on use of force? John, you responded with the CCRB is willing to do know your rights trainings. Maybe if you could drop the email for everyone. And if anyone else wanted to weigh in there too, I open it up. Okay, we can move on to the next question then. Next question is,
So
how
I
do you...
think I put the email in my answer.
There was a response that it didn't work, so I just want to make sure we had the right email. How do you hold accountable the persons higher up who are secretly supporting the officers who commit these crimes? Very hard question.
Oh, well, I wanted to say that I thought that was completely impossible before, until I learned about bills and laws, right? I think in the way that we learn it in school, it just seems like such a far-fetched idea. It just seems like it's out of reach. Only being in this situation, unfortunately, this is how it had to happen. I think that that's where organizations, on the ground organizations come in, stepping out into the community and telling people what is available to them. So helping to write bills, going to Albany, speaking with your local politicians, and just like starting there on a local level, and being part of an organization, and accessing resources and accessing local politicians is also a way in going to events, but understanding that we're not powerless in these situations, that we are the people who are allowing people who are public servants to do all of the things that public servants do. And so we do have a voice. This is, they're working for the public. And so making sure that they're actually working for the public, but understanding that they're not inaccessible. We do have access to them. And if they do make themselves unavailable or not accessible, demanding that they have a meeting with us, going to town halls, holding town halls, and different space for people to say, listen, hear me out. You have to hear me out, because public servants are there to service the public.
Thank you, Victoria. Another question, has anyone pursued an investigation due to a police department funding less than lethal equipment, but not using it? There's an example raised in the question from Spokane, Washington, where the police department has paid $64,000 for pepperball guns, a lot of money for ballistic shields, but haven't used them even when dealing with mental health crises, and instead are shooting. So the police have the equipment to try to not be lethal, but they refuse to use it. Anyone able to answer that?
I was just going to say, it's a great question. I haven't heard of anything, but I thought it was a very interesting question. And again, it goes back that like we're training police to do a job that like they're actually not doing, that they're not doing. Yeah, so
I think it is very related to the previous question about how do you hold folks accountable who are bosses for the potential misconduct of their subordinates. And one of the problems in New York is that in New York City is that we've chopped up who is responsible for overseeing what kind of misbehavior by the police. So my agency, we have jurisdiction over misconduct by uniformed members of service who are on duty, but not necessarily into the civilian folks who are making the policies that control the macro level of police policy and police actions. And with regard to de-escalation, we look at how officers act in a situation, and we take into account their responsibility. And the patrol guide now in New York City mandates that officers try and de-escalate situations. And it's one of the more complicated parts of a use of force investigation.
Okay, with our last two questions, I'm going to try to combine them real quick because I know we're about to end. So one question was, from what you've all experienced, are communities equipped with the necessary resources and knowledge to begin to have those conversations to create accountability in the justice system? And another question was, who's responsible to begin the community engagement process with police?
So I'll start. I think that the police should have a community policing program. So they should be, but if they are not, and I'm going to presume in many circumstances they are not proactively engaging with members of the community, then community needs to find a way to engage with them. And it is probably uncomfortable for most people to, and they simply don't want to go to the police department. There are other avenues, right? You can do it through, the Chamber of Commerce. You can do it through your faith leader. You can do it through other people who might be leaders in the community and who would not be as intimidated and would be willing to work in a group such that you'd be more comfortable and have more access. So I think there are probably a lot of outlets, but people may not realize that. And so it could be a block club, another community group, but there are ways to access if you are not comfortable doing that individually.
So I'll say two things. One, in terms of whose responsibility are these various aspects. First and foremost, and I know that there was a previous question about mental health response. So news just came out today that San Diego's mental health first responder model is now responding to the vast majority of all mental health calls in the city with unarmed non-police responders. San Francisco actually has the majority of those mental health calls now responded to by unarmed non-police first responders, mental health clinicians, social workers. So we already are seeing examples in some of the largest cities in the country of not only a small proportion of these mental health situations being diverted to an alternative provider, but the vast majority of these calls in some cases, which proves that communities and community-based organizations and other agencies, whether that's public health department or what have you, social services, even the fire department, can play a huge role in helping to offset some of the burden from police agencies in responding, and as a consequence, create a more humane response where people are not being harmed. We don't have people with guns going into a situation who are not at all trained to deal with mental health crises. And so that has to be a part of the solution, is scaling up what works, scaling up those models in other places. And in California, you have the Crises Act, which was signed into law a few years ago, which creates a statewide grant fund to fund those programs and scale them up in communities where the data shows there are the highest rates of use of force and the largest racial disparities in policing. So a data-driven approach
Sam just froze for me and everyone else is moving. So Sam, I'm sorry we lost you at the very end. I apologize. And I saw a question about whether
and to alleviate some of the other thing is communities can play.
Sorry, Sam, I think you're having some internet problems at the very end. Sorry. Yeah, you cut out. But do you want to finish your thought real quick?
Yeah, I'm saying the Crises Act, California is a good model of what a state can do to invest in what works and scale up those mental health first response models. We're already seeing the data show that they're remarkably effective. They're not calling the police for backup. They don't find themselves in danger on the scene just because they aren't armed or not police. And so I think we should learn more from those programs and scale them up.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining. I want to thank our really amazing panelists, Sam Zinyangwe, Lisa Madigan, Victoria Davis, Jonathan Darsh, and Caroline Nobo. And I am so delighted to have had you all. And this is recorded. We will be sending it out in the next few days. So please make sure to check that out. We also have monthly webinars, as I mentioned, so please sign up at prosecution.org to make sure you don't miss out on our future events. But thank you all for this really important discussion. For more information on this topic, you can also read our publication series, including one of our guides that's focused solely on community engagement in police accountability work. So we really encourage you to check that out. And we just want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Here.